Over the years, we have seen countless bosses leave their mark on the legacy of Like a Dragon. Some became fan favorites right out the gate, whereas others have become major points of contention that the community still debates on. Suffice it to say, this series has a colorful repertoire of bosses, but every once in a while, we are greeted with a boss whose qualities are almost universally agreed upon, regardless of personal preference. And I believe the centerpiece of today's discussion will soon become one such example. Today, we'll be talking about the final boss of Like a Dragon Gaiden, the man behind the Hanya mask, Shishido Kosei. I realize that even with my usual way of titling these character analyses, calling a character perfect is quite a leap to make. So to immediately clarify, no, I am not calling Shishido the single greatest boss of the entire franchise, though there is an argument to be made there. What makes a boss perfect, at least from my standpoint, is the efficiency with which they execute on what they're striving to be. A mechanical culmination of the games, a worthy adversary for the protagonist, someone that stands out on their own terms and through their own strength, etc. So depending on how many goals you set for your character, the greater the risk will be of them straying from this intended perfection. But despite the mere 6-month-long development cycle that Gaiden had, or perhaps because of said cycle, Shishido became someone who executed on every intended concept with razor-sharp precision, all the while undoing many past mistakes that RGG was saddled with when constructing some of their other villains. So then, let's see how Shishido became what I would consider to be the perfect Yakuza boss. A staple of RGG's story writing is the fact that the final boss of a given game will likely be someone who was introduced incredibly early in the story, and when you couple that with most new characters being given a comparable level of attention and screen time, this means any one of the figures you meet could wind up being the final boss. While this is a captivating concept, it becomes a rather risky one to balance around when you consider RGG's tendency of writing more and more ambitious narratives with an ever-increasing cast size. If you offer this form of basis to so many characters at once, you may be left with insufficient time to fully flesh out the one who'd eventually become the final boss. But RGG's story writing would always yield some gems, regardless of the narrative scope. And this made me wonder what would happen if the RGG of today would tackle a more concise narrative with everything they've learned so far. So after experiments like the Majima Saga and the Kaito files before it, Gaiden felt like the perfect catalyst to finally push this formula to the max. And its crowning achievement was Shishido himself. Shishido is a character that is not only present from the very beginning, but is also a prominent part of nearly every chapter. He takes on different roles as our outlook on the narrative changes, ranging from being an outright obstacle to surpass, to being a complicated ally, to eventually becoming the final boss who'd embody the very last breath of the Yakuza's legacy. And the reason why he can execute on all of these premises without coming off as inconsistent or insincere is because we've interacted with him so frequently throughout the story. Our very first encounter with him was at the docks, and even though we don't clash with Shishido specifically, he is the person commandeering all of the soldiers that swarmed us, and the way he went about it is as cheeky as you could get. He deliberately stands out, whether we're talking about the flashy shirt, the gigantic mallet, or the use of a Hanya mask. Hell, considering the fact that he is also an Omi man, you could take his use of the Hanya to be a way of besmirching the legacy of a prominent Tojo figure, and further rub salt into the wound. Even without speaking a word, he immediately left his mark. So even if Kiryu wasn't there to see this mayhem in person, word of a madman with a Hanya mask would surely reach him and pique his interest. Mind you, while this is an admirable starting point even from just a general observation, it is important to note that both the event at the docks and the first actual fights we have with Shishido all happen in Chapter 1. The journey has just begun, and yet we're already breaking mainline series convention, as you'd usually have to wait until the second half of the game before you finally get to square off against the ultimate villain in a proper one-on-one. Not only that, but you technically have two back-to-back boss fights with Shishido, both of which have an overture brimming with emotional impact. So despite still not knowing who this guy is, we are invested in the conflict. Now, we will deconstruct the sequence in more detail later on, but for now, the main thing to take note of is that by the end of these fights, Shishido is still standing. This may not sound like much, but when you consider how Kiryu had no reason to hold back, and how he even went as far as to switch back to his signature fighting style, you just know there's more to this opponent than meets the eye. It's been a while since we've seen someone even remotely challenge Kiryu in strength after all, so with our fight here being woefully cut short, the anticipation for a rematch can only grow. But then, the story takes a rather unexpected turn. We do keep seeing Shishido as the narrative progresses, but we're never given a reason to resume our fight, and Kiryu is the last person to attack someone unprovoked. So instead, we have this air of tension that persists between them, as we learn more and more about Shishido as a person. These moments don't overstay their welcome either, because they're integrated to resemble a regular person simply airing out internal grievances, as opposed to a final boss giving his last soliloquy to build up to an ultimate fight. And narrative pieces like this are sprinkled all throughout his screen time, making it feel like we've known Shishido for much longer than we actually have. So then, what is the human behind this facade actually like? Well, he's an utterly broken individual. Someone who sought solace in the underworld and was given one of the worst trials by fire that we'd seen up to now. With everything he had to go through to become a lieutenant, it's natural that he'd have a grudge to carry, and some pent-up frustration just waiting to explode. But at the same time, you see a glimpse into an admirable quality to him as well. His very particular brand of loyalty. Through the circumstances of his life, he has found an unyielding resolve in protecting what he values, whether it be his place in the world, the legacy of the Watase family, or perhaps the legacy of the Yakuza as a whole. And when we catch onto this tendency of his, we're led to believe that the tide of our relationship with this character is slowly turning. With the nature of Yakuza villains eventually becoming our aniki, and the fact that we wind up befriending Tsuruno over time, it would be natural to believe that this newfound camaraderie would extend to Shishido as well. This is even further solidified with the fact we spend an entire chapter partying with the Watase family and tag-teaming the Kijin clan HQ with Shishido specifically. If there was any doubt present in our minds before this, Chapter 4 would have surely alleviated it. And then, when we're at our most comfortable, the narrative quite literally twists the knife. The long-established series convention of humanizing antagonists to the point where we accept them as good people being given a poor hand in life is now flipped on its head, because this time we didn't see yet another redemption, and by extension, it would appear that Shishido's intentions never once wavered. From his perspective, all of this palling around was nothing more than a temporary truce, and the place where the tension he initially exuded at the start of the story would finally re-emerge was chosen to be the end of Chapter 4, right before the finale of Gaiden would commence. Frankly, this was just a perfect choice, because now that we've seen Shishido's actions after the fight with Nishitani, ones that resulted in him seemingly executing the Kijin clan patriarch, you remember why you felt so on edge while first facing Shishido in combat. And in retrospect, it's not like any of this comes out of left field. See, if a person born from violence finally establishes trust with a person or lifestyle, then what would happen if someone endangered that trust, that stability? Well, the person would fight back, which is exactly what Shishido did in the finale. He protected the life he made for himself, even if it was at the cost of the people who were by him along the way. The end goal for the Watase family and Kiryu may have been the dissolution of the Yakuza as a whole, in the hopes of helping the men of the underworld finally start anew. But if the Yakuza are truly gone, if the bloody trail Shishido left while slowly rising to the top suddenly dissipated, what else would be left for him? What purpose would his life and struggles up to now have had? The exposition at the end may have come off as just more delusions of grandeur on our villain's part, but the conflict that we eventually saw between Kiryu and Shishido was much deeper than a regular one-on-one we were so used to seeing. These two quite literally embody the opposing ideologies of starting anew versus protecting the past at any cost. It may be a fruitless effort, but this fight is all Shishido has left, because the future is just that uncertain. So he struggles. He brings countless others into his dream, this ideal that everything they've sacrificed up to now would not be in vain. That they, the individuals who made up this lifestyle, truly mattered all this time. And this is what makes the final fight so beautiful. It is quite literally a sunset over a once thriving empire, an end of days that we all cherished in one way or another. But rather than feeling sad that it's over, I'd say that the end of this fight will leave us feeling hopeful. As was shown in games like Lost Judgment, the criminal underworld will always exist in one form or another. It's simply a way of maintaining the, at times, cruel balance of life. So no matter the times, no matter the people involved, our human tenacity will always shine through these struggles between light and darkness. Gaiden's final fight is much less of a last farewell and more of a climax to remember, in a legacy that will keep being written even though the names of the groups involved may change over time. Though he saw the end of the Yakuza with his own eyes, Shishido still managed to reach the top he always dreamed of, even if he didn't realize it himself. In the eyes of many, he will always be remembered as a legend. Shishido Kosei, the lone protector of the Omi. Seeing as we've now offered a general overview of the character, it's time to address a massive point of contention. The one rather unfortunate thing about Shishido is that you can't do a proper analysis on him without relating it to another prominent villain from the series. And yes, we can finally stop being so coy about it, because Aizawa Masato is the one ever-persistent character that will always be brought up when discussing Shishido. And the reasons for that should be self-evident if you experienced Yakuza 5 for yourself. However, while many fans in the community have stated that Gaiden's final boss is merely an homage to Aizawa, I'd consider it less of an homage and more so a case of finally doing justice to the initial concept from Yakuza 5. Shishido succeeds everywhere where Aizawa couldn't, for a multitude of reasons that make the story of 5 such a divisive topic in the community. Now, in the interest of sticking to the most important aspects between these two characters, this will be a condensed view on Aizawa, and even then it will be a brunt of this very video due to how inseparable these two characters can be and how complex 5's narrative is to properly analyze. We will focus on 3 major points of comparison, and the first one will be consistency in character writing. Initially, I found Aizawa to be quite a compelling character. While he was hot-headed and inexperienced, his heart was always in the right place, and he was loyal to a fault when it came to the people he truly cared for, like for example, Morinaga. This characterization of Aizawa was consistent throughout the entirety of part 1 of the story, and even persisted in chapters 1 and 3 of the finale, when he talked to Saejima. The point where his character writing takes a nosedive is specifically the very last chapter, where Aizawa pulls a 180 and suddenly shares his father's ideology or dream. Despite the fact we've never seen these two directly interact throughout the entire game, not even through an obscured flashback that could have added weight or proper meaning to this sudden turn of events. Showing a moment of Aizawa being enraged at the plan his father set out for him, actively lashing out at Kurosawa himself, or perhaps elaborating on their fractured relationship, all could have made way for this change in motivation to come off as an example of emotional conflict. But due to the way it was framed, it merely came off as senselessly hypocritical behavior that took away from the impact of the encounter. Mind you, it's not that Aizawa couldn't have worked as a final boss, but he clearly wasn't envisioned as one until the very last second. And despite the fact we have to spend 15 minutes observing back and forth monologues in an attempt to justify this twist, and in turn reframing Aizawa's established role in the narrative, the overall writing ultimately fails to be as consistent or as compelling as that of most other villains in the series. This wouldn't have even been that much of an issue if this character hadn't taken so many cues from older bosses without expanding on those elements. The writers suddenly saddled him with so many roles to play by the end that he ultimately came off as an attempt at making an amalgamation of prior tropes rather than being a compelling opponent in his own right. Shishido, on the other hand, was written to fulfill all of his different roles from the very beginning, as was elaborated upon in the previous chapter, and he was persistently portrayed as someone you could never fully trust. Not only do you clash with him at numerous points in the story, but even at a point where we spent a whole chapter palling around with him and the rest of the Watase family, the writers quickly made it apparent that Shishido will, without fail, always do what suits him. And none of this came from a proposed shared ideology, it came from a selfish desire to be at the very top, a sentiment that has persisted from the moment we first clashed with him, all the way to the end. The reason why the premise of hiding in plain sight worked for Shishido and not for Aizawa was because Shishido was not only established as a threat in the first encounter, but also because we could have inferred as much from seeing him run loose all throughout the story with our own eyes. Meanwhile, Aizawa was unfortunately saddled with having off-screen interactions built towards his heel turn, with no meaningful show of force that could present him as a threat or worthy opponent. Which brings us to the next point of comparison, the justification of the final fight through a show of strength. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, considering Kiryu's fighting prowess throughout the series, it becomes increasingly harder for the writers to frame anyone as a possible threat to him. Kiryu is so physically strong that the only way to even the playing field would be through a villain's use of underhanded tactics, or by severely nerfing Kiryu via a fatal wound and exhausting long battle before the final encounter. But those writing tactics by themselves won't be enough to make for a memorable or beloved villain. If you want the encounter to feel meaningful, you'd either need the boss to be of somewhat comparable physical strength to the hero, or have so much narrative weight to them to where the emotion behind the fight is more important than strength alone. So while the latter example is hard to justify in Yakuza 5's case, due to Aizawa's character writing coming off as inconsistent, you could still make him a worthy adversary in the finale through an undeniable show of strength preceding the fight. But therein lies the other problem. See, we're meant to believe that Aizawa hid his potential all throughout the game, so that no one would suspect him of being involved in Kurosawa's power play. This is what many have used as a means of plausible deniability for the underlying weight of the fight. After all, if you've never seen Aizawa, quote, get serious, then who's to say that he doesn't have what it takes to best Kiryu? But if you want to go down that route, there's so many ways this could have been communicated to the player in a more meaningful way. Think back to the fight between Kiryu and the tag team of Aizawa and Morinaga. These two were quite literally floored by the end of the encounter. Now, if Aizawa showed signs of exhaustion, but still stood on his feet by the end of the encounter, unlike Morinaga, even that could have served as a bit of foreshadowing about his underlying strength. Same thing with the fight against Saejima. Considering how Kurosawa's power play was well underway by this point, and how the only people at the Colosseum during this fight were Aizawa, Saejima, and the Florist, you could have had the fight end in a draw. Which I know sounds absurd considering Saejima's amazing strength, but keep in mind, Shishido had a moment of such symbolism in his own finale. He took a knife straight through the hand and still managed to push off both Majima and Saejima. Admittedly, the two of them were in shock, but this is still Shishido operating while being both severely wounded and tired out after the fight that occurred at the construction site earlier. Going back to Aizawa, the only show of force we see of him is when he beats down some random nobody at the Colosseum, and when he apparently dispatched everyone at the Tojo HQ from off-screen. Again, you could have shown a brief cutscene of Aizawa going on a rampage to build anticipation, but instead, we're left with yet another case of telling instead of showing firsthand. Though, considering Saijima's and Majima's remarks on how most of the Tojo members today are half-assed Yakuza who only want to get money, even the aforementioned show of force wouldn't have turned the tables for Aizawa completely. But it would have been something. The way it stands now, all of his talk about the strongest always having to win and him training in the shadows means nothing when he didn't justify any of it through his own actions that the players could witness front and center. Once again, Shishido was given a number of occasions to prove he is worthy of challenging Kiryu, both by standing his ground in their back-to-back fights in Ijincho, as well as through the aforementioned show of strength when emerging at the Omi headquarters. The last major point of comparison would be the fights themselves. When taking the issues shown in the handling of Aizawa into account, I find it impossible to relish in the scale of the fight, as the version of the character we wound up with did nothing to earn such a royal treatment. The emotional value of the fight stems from Kiryu being close to death, meaning that Aizawa could have been replaced by any other villain from Yakuza 5 claiming Kurosawa was their father, and it would have had the exact same impact. Which begs the question, why should someone that merely stumbled into such a position be worthy of any genuine praise? Well, because the fight is long and involved, right? And that's where my final gripe with Aizawa lies. Not even the fight itself is original. The premise of a boss fight progressing through the Tojo clan was already done in Yakuza 2, and the only difference here is that instead of loading screens, we have so many QTEs to where the flow of the fight will be interrupted just as frequently. The idea of a koi symbolizing the drive to surpass oneself, and by extension Kiryu as the dragon, was already done with Nishiki, and with even more implied value, thanks to them also being labeled as childhood friends, even when only looking at the PS2 game. Discarding a sword to have a more honorable fight in the end was already done with Ryuji, and even though I'm not a huge fan of Ryuji, he stands out as the first true rival dragon at the very least. So all that Aizawa is left with in the end is being a proof of concept, and not a deliberately constructed character. To conclude this chapter, how did Shishido manage to circumvent all of the aforementioned pitfalls? Well, for one thing, we have a boss fight progressing through the Omi headquarters, and while we did go through some long battles in this interior, this is the first time we have a proper one-on-one boss fight evolving through the area in such a manner. The action segments and QTEs are used explicitly to signal the end of a major phase in the conflict and adequately progress to the next portion of the HQ, as opposed to QTEs just being sprinkled in for the hell of it. Shishido's Irazumi is also one we've yet to face off against, and by nature of Gaiden in its entirety, having a clearly defined start and end point, the same was mirrored in both Shishido's character arc and his well-deserved shot at glory. Was Aizawa's fight necessary to have Shishido's be as refined as it is? Yes, absolutely, and that's an opinion that I hold of Yakuza 5 as a whole. The mistakes that were made there are a big reason as to why the series has improved afterwards. The team learned where their strengths lied, and they harnessed them as intended. But at the end of the day, do-overs like the one with Shishido are just that. They're attempts at making things right, and not an homage to the value that something from the past may have carried. Now that we've tackled the biggest point of contention, we can finally return to the man of the hour, and see how his fights embellish the characterization even further via ludonarrative harmony. With regards to our encounters with Shishido, they've taken on many forms, from instances of fighting him one-on-one, to fighting him in a group, akin to the chaos that occurred at the construction site, and even fights where he accompanied us, like when we raided the Kijin clan HQ. For the purposes of this segment, we will focus on the one-on-one fights, and those include the two back-to-back fights in Ijincho and the final fight at the Omi headquarters. The first one is a natural escalation of a villainous figure that made their mark at an early point, now coming to finish the job. But at this point, we aren't meant to see him as an individual with his own drive or ideology. Rather, we're meant to see Shishido as something almost inhuman, an entity of chaos, where the use of a Hanya mask and the OST being the standard boss theme makes him seem like an obstacle to surpass. Think of it like the fight against Hangman on different occasions throughout the series. Then, this character dynamic evolves into something different, thanks to the cinematics separating the two Ijincho encounters. Now, rather than seeing him as an entity, we see him as a living, breathing person. The comments about Kiryu's identity as a dragon fading now undertake a new meaning, thanks to how deliberate Shishido's character design really is. While the clothing and bravado are inherently attention-grabbing, the face beneath the mask shows a man that seemingly clawed their way out of hell itself. It makes you wonder what brought him to this point, and if there's anything pure still left in them, because this overburdened expression tells a completely different story to the actions tied to it. So now that we have more semblances of depth being given, observing Shishido out of context could make him appear like a longtime rival. He even taunts Kiryu to get back to who he really is. Not the fancy agent neutralization tactics, but a bloody one-on-one brawl, where you connect and dance with the other person's demons, in an attempt to overcome everything that burdens you. The second fight is more so about Kiryu reconnecting with his old self through this clash, exemplified by the fact the OST following this encounter is Kiryu's theme, specifically the song Bring It On, which plays during your use of the Yakuza/Oryu style. The only way why someone would need to go back to their old ways would be if their new approach to life simply wasn't cutting it anymore. So the fact Shishido managed to get that out of him means that Kiryu sees him as a more worthy adversary than anyone he'd faced for the Daidoji. This moment feels like the casting of a stone into a river, and Kiryu acting out for the rest of the game is the ripple that came from it. From this point onwards, we start humanizing Shishido more and more, in classic Like a Dragon fashion, to make you think this adversary finally became your friend. But as we discussed in the first part of the video, this was just a clever misdirection. So between the fake attack on Nishitani and the coup of sorts at the construction site and Omi HQ, we conclude his cycle of character evolution with his final phase showing him as a wounded beast that needs to be laid to rest, both for your sake and for the sake of everyone who sacrificed so much to reach this point, which includes Shishido himself. If there was one fight in the series that genuinely felt like it carried the impact of an all-out war that engulfed thousands of soldiers at once, it would have to be this one. Kiryu being one of the last members of the Tojo clan still mindful of their legacy, and Shishido being the last ember of the fire that the Omi held for decades, make for the most memorable clash that these two factions have ever seen. And by the merits of this game, the last clash these factions would ever see. The final fight has it all. From the deliberate QTEs and steady progression through the Omi HQ that were mentioned earlier, to continuous back and forths where each of the fighters has a moment to gain the upper hand. We have Kiryu being cocky once again, Shishido actively improvising as the environment changes, and the use of the good old spider tool to elevate the whole fight to a level none of us had anticipated, even when comparing this fight to the one with Aizawa. And we even have two unique boss themes that couldn't be stylistically further apart, but still resulting in the same torrent of emotions. The first of these themes, Deadly Struggle, is one of the heaviest songs we've heard in the series, so it makes sense that it would be used to harness the aggression and chaos of such a fight. Between the triggered bass drums, Mike Portnoy-style drum fills, the song being played with a guitar in drop D tuning, and all of it being complemented via apocalyptic-sounding string arrangements, this track alone feels like you're witnessing the end of the world unfolding before you. And when you couple it with the action from the first two phases of the fight, this couldn't have been a better fit. But then we finally see the switch. from the chaos within the Omi HQ to the tranquility outside the rooms. Shishido's last stand is all but gone. The soldiers he riled up were beaten down by the most prominent figures of the Tojo clan's profound history, and all that's left of this conflict is one man fighting the greatest legend of all. As hard as Shishido tried, this was the point where he had to face reality, and the music alters from a declaration of vengeance to a sorrowful eulogy. Fleeting Dream, with its driving rhythm and epic guitar melodies, feels like the climax to a story that lasted for centuries. And yet, this fight, if seen bereft of its symbolism, is merely a clash between two figures who just met days ago. The fact that RGG were so confident in this character that they gave him this many roles to play within such a short game is bold, to say the least. And the fact he delivered on everything that was covered in this video is nothing less than astonishing, down to the very way how Shishido's story arc actually concluded. Once the fight with Kiryu ends, the heroes go on their merry way, and repeat what must be the biggest sticking point amongst all Yakuza plot twists to date. The dreaded act of turning your back on an enemy who is still conscious. Once I've seen this view from the game's camera, I was certain that Shishido would find a leftover gun and just shoot Tsuruno, once again leading us to a classic mournful farewell for a great character. But no, Shishido is not only stopped, but also given the harshest atonement you could think of. He's dragged into the Daidoji faction, where he would presumably spend the rest of his days. And I'm gonna be honest with you, this hurt a lot more than any forced attempt at painting him as a good guy ever could. The dude wore his bleeding heart on his sleeve, and throughout all of his struggle to escape the chains that once bound him, he ended up right where he started. An epilogue as fitting as it is tragic, without a single life being taken in the end. So, if all of the praise from earlier wasn't enough of a justification, then how could I condense the essence of this character's qualities in as few words as possible? Well, what makes Shishido so special is that he's just a classic Yakuza. He isn't a chosen one, a secret heir to a legacy, or a politician seeking to control the world. He's nothing more than a Yakuza at his core. Though physically stronger than most, his convictions are ones we've seen hundreds of times over the course of the series, but here they are finally bereft of any bloat or any shackles. This boss is simply a pure diamond, and makes for the best send-off to a legacy I could have hoped to see. So yeah, this was my view on Shishido Kosei. I'm sorry for being more heavy-handed with the metaphors in this one, but the experience of Gaiden is still very fresh in my memory, and describing it will always leave me with more things I want to share to hopefully get that meaning across. Even if you're not one for lengthy video essays, I'd reckon an average player could still understand what many of us see in Shishido just by playing through Gaiden, and that's all that really matters in the end. Anyway, if there's another topic you would like to see discussed here, feel free to suggest it in the comments. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed your stay. So, until next time, take care of yourselves and have a great day. Cheers.